Have you ever poured your soul into someone, trusting them completely, only to have that trust shattered in the most public and brutal way imaginable? The waiting room of the private maternity wing was meant to be a sanctuary, a place filled with the soft, anxious whispers of families and the steady, hopeful rhythm of life. Instead, it became the shocking stage for an act so vile, so brazen, that the entire hospital would be talking about it for years to come. The harsh fluorescent lights glared down on the polished floors, catching every single glint of the diamonds on Alexander Grant's wrist. It was as though her appointment was nothing more than an inconvenient pause in his relentless empire-building schedule. Yet, what happened next went far beyond mere stress. The nurse finally appeared in the doorway, calling her name with a gentle smile. Evelyn rose carefully, pressing a hand against the small of her back, and offered a soft, hopeful smile to Alexander. "It's just a quick check. You don't have to stay if you're busy," she whispered, hoping to soothe his escalating temper. But Alexander's face twisted into a sharp, cruel mask, his voice suddenly booming across the silent waiting room. "Don't you dare embarrass me, Evelyn. Do you honestly think I have time to sit here while you waste everyone's day with your nonsense?" A thick, uncomfortable hush fell over the other patients. A young mother holding her toddler pulled the child closer, her eyes wide with shock. An elderly man slowly put down his magazine and just stared. Evelyn's cheeks burned a deep crimson. She desperately wanted the floor to swallow her whole, but she forced herself to keep moving, clutching her folder like a shield. "Please, not here. Not like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached for his arm, silently begging him to lower his voice. And that was when it happened. With a sharp, ugly crack that echoed against the sterile walls, Alexander's hand connected forcefully with her cheek. The sound was louder than the beeping monitors, louder than the collective gasp of the nurse frozen in the doorway, louder than Evelyn's own heartbeat shattering inside her chest. She stumbled backward, one hand flying instinctively to her face, her eyes instantly filling with hot tears. Gasps erupted from the onlookers. Someone quickly pulled out a phone and started recording. Another person shouted for security, but Alexander only straightened his cufflinks, his voice dripping with icy disdain. "Maybe now you'll finally learn to stop whining like a child. You're my wife. Start acting like it." "Sir, this is a hospital. You can't do that here," she stammered. But her words were drowned out by Evelyn's muffled sob. The child who deserved so much better than this senseless violence, this heartless cruelty. The eyes of these strangers were no longer filled with admiration for his wealth, but with raw, unfiltered disgust. He sneered, grabbing Evelyn's wrist with unnecessary and painful force. "Let's go. You're wasting enough of my time as it is." His blinding arrogance blinded him to the devastating truth. He was a CEO whose vast empire stretched across countless industries, a titan whose handshake could raise or sink a company's value in a matter of seconds. But the moment his eyes locked onto the angry, red mark blooming on his daughter's tear-streaked face, something primal inside him snapped. Richard's voice cut through the chaos like a razor-sharp blade. "Take your hands off her. Now." Alexander froze, his arrogance faltering for the very first time. He stammered, "Richard, this is just a misunderstanding." But Richard's eyes, as cold and hard as steel, left absolutely no room for excuses. Every security guard in the building seemed to materialize at once, their radios crackling to life. The slap that Alexander thought would vanish into silence was now immortalized forever. But she also felt a wave of terror. The millionaire who thought he was completely untouchable had no idea what a violent storm he had just awakened. He was a man who built empires and crushed his enemies in courtrooms without ever breaking a sweat. And now, every single ounce of his power, every lawyer, every connection, every last dollar would be used for one single purpose, to utterly destroy Alexander Grant. The security team escorted a protesting Alexander out of the building. And the world? It would watch every single second of his spectacular fall from grace. Because the cameras were already rolling, and Richard Cole was just getting started. Though she stood small and fragile in the hospital that night, her story was one of resilience, immense sacrifice, and misplaced faith in the absolute wrong man. From the moment she entered the world, headlines predicted a dazzling future for her, the daughter of an empire, a princess of corporate royalty. Mansions, private jets, yachts, those were simply the background noise of her privileged childhood. From that moment on, Evelyn clung to her mother's values, striving to live a life grounded in compassion rather than in privilege. She studied literature at Columbia University, not finance or business as her father had secretly hoped. But Evelyn had absolutely no interest in boardrooms. She wanted love, a real family, a life of meaning that went beyond stock prices and ruthless power plays. A hustler in a sharp suit with a dazzling smile that promised the entire world. Against her father's stern and repeated warnings, she fell deeply in love. Their courtship was a whirlwind of late-night walks in Central Park, romantic rooftop dinners beneath the glittering city lights, and whispered promises of forever. For a young woman yearning for warmth and a sense of belonging, his constant attention felt absolutely intoxicating. Richard Cole, however, was never convinced. But Evelyn, stubborn in her belief in love, dismissed it as simple paternal protectiveness. She told herself that Alexander's temper was just passion, his sharp words just a result of stress. After all, wasn't every marriage about patience and compromise? But slowly, insidiously, the cracks began to appear. Alexander's ambition hardened into a cold, cruel arrogance. Evelyn, pregnant with their first child, often found herself alone at home while Alexander partied with investors and posed for magazine covers. Her once loving husband now criticized her weight, her clothes, her supposed laziness. The man who had once brought her flowers now brought only sharp, cutting words. She remembered her mother's words, "Kindness builds bridges." And she hoped that love could rebuild theirs. But the night he slapped her in that hospital, in front of strangers and staff, shattered the very last of her illusions. She was not a victim to be pitied, but a woman who had endured far too long in silence. What Alexander had mistaken for fragility was, in truth, remarkable restraint. Her father watched her in heavy silence, his jaw tight with fury, his hand gently covering hers. Finally, she whispered, "I thought I could change him." The weight of those words settled over her like a sacred vow. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever, safety. She was no longer just a pregnant wife enduring cruelty. And soon, very soon, she would discover the incredible power she had inherited all along. For Alexander, it was only the beginning of a nightmare he never saw coming. Because Evelyn's story was not about being slapped in silence. It was about rising in vengeance. For Evelyn, the hospital, the penthouse, and the looming courtroom would each become powerful symbols of her pain, of betrayal, and finally, of a long overdue reckoning. To truly grasp the scale of what was about to unfold, one must first walk through these spaces, breathe their air, and see how every wall carried the echoes of choices and their consequences. The hospital was supposed to be a sanctuary. Its maternity wing was lined with pastel walls painted with cheerful murals of balloons and teddy bears, all meant to soothe anxious mothers waiting for their newborns. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. But for Evelyn, the hospital had become the stage of her ultimate humiliation. People were still whispering about it days later. A nurse who had witnessed the entire event retold the story in hushed, shocked tones in the hospital cafeteria. The hospital halls carried that memory like a permanent scar. Evelyn, though deeply grateful for her father's intervention, could not step into those sterile corridors without hearing the echo of that sharp crack across her face. From the hospital, her life shifted back to the penthouse, a place that looked like heaven from the outside but had long since felt like a cold, lonely hell. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed glittering city lights at night, but inside, the air was always cold, sterile, and eerily silent. Imported Italian marble, massive chandeliers dripping with crystals, and designer furniture that looked as if it had never been touched, except for staged photo shoots. It was a home built for appearances, not for love. The beautiful crib he had promised to build was still in its boxes. His office, by stark contrast, was immaculate, a veritable shrine to his own ambition. A massive desk stood where million-dollar deals were struck, but where Evelyn's desperate pleas for compassion were consistently ignored. Here, she had clutched her growing stomach, whispering lullabies to a child she promised would never, ever feel unloved, even if she herself felt completely invisible. With her father's return, it became a mountain of evidence. And then there was the courtroom. Unlike the hospital or the penthouse, Evelyn had not yet stepped into this intimidating setting, but it was coming. Lawyers whispered strategies, judges' gavels thundered to restore order, and the distinct scent of paper and ink hung in the air. It was here that Alexander's carefully curated image of power and prestige would be systematically stripped away. The thought of sitting across from the man who had humiliated her, of reliving her pain in front of complete strangers, made her stomach churn with anxiety. "You don't walk into that courtroom alone," Richard told her, his hand firm on hers. "You walk in with me, with the truth, and with justice. And together, we'll make sure he never hurts you or your child again." These three settings, the hospital, the penthouse, and the courtroom, were no longer just places. The hospital represented her breaking point, the penthouse her captivity, and the courtroom, her rebirth. Each space carried its own weight, its own scars, its own promise. These places would not protect Alexander. They would expose him. Because soon, under the blinding lights of the courtroom, Alexander Grant would learn the most brutal lesson of his entire life: money could not shield him from the justice of a father's wrath and a daughter's rising voice. And when Evelyn finally stepped into that courtroom, the world would see not a broken wife, but the beginning of a powerful reckoning. For Alexander Grant, pride wasn't just a flaw, it was the very foundation of his existence. To the world, he was a millionaire visionary, a man who had climbed from middle-class obscurity into Manhattan's gilded elite. But behind the tailored suits, the champagne galas, and the razor-sharp smile was a heart hardened by greed, vanity, and a chilling cruelty. If Evelyn was the soul of this story, Alexander was its consuming darkness. From a very early age, he burned with a deep resentment for his poverty. By the time he was in college, he had turned that resentment into a ravenous hunger. Not a hunger for knowledge, but a hunger for power. At 21, he dropped out of business school, arrogantly claiming that the professors were too small-minded to teach him anything of value. By 25, he had leveraged credit cards and risky loans into a small startup, convincing investors with flashy pitches and greatly inflated numbers. His empire, though shaky in its foundation, grew on pure bravado. Investors believed in him simply because he believed in himself so completely. To outsiders, their union looked like a modern-day fairy tale, the self-made millionaire and the beautiful daughter of a CEO dynasty. For Alexander, however, Evelyn was not about love. She was about leverage. Their name opened doors that his hustler background never could. He would criticize Evelyn's clothes, saying they weren't stylish enough for his public image. He would constantly remind her of his sacrifices, sneering, "I work 12 hours a day while you just sit around with your books." The slap in the hospital was not the first time he had raised his hand to her. She had stumbled, catching herself on the sharp edge of a marble counter. And though the bruise eventually faded, the fear did not. But men like Alexander never change. They only escalate. His social media feeds showed him donating oversized checks to charities, hosting glittering galas, and shaking hands with influential senators. But those who worked closely with him knew the disturbing truth. Alexander Grant was a tyrant. Assistants cycled through his office every 3 months, completely broken by his explosive rages. Business partners whispered of shady deals, of numbers that didn't quite add up, but his charisma, his sheer audacity, kept the illusion alive. It was his unshakable belief that he was completely untouchable. He thought his money insulated him from all consequences. He thought Evelyn's silence was eternal. He thought no one, not even the powerful Richard Cole, could ever touch him. That blinding arrogance blinded him to the storm that was forming right at his feet. He actually believed he could smooth everything over with a simple handshake, a forced smile, or perhaps even a check. His empire had taught him one powerful lesson, that power always bends to money. He believed that kindness was stupidity. He believed that loyalty was a leash and that betrayal was power. For Evelyn, he had become a living nightmare. And the same arrogance that made him slap a pregnant woman in public would be replayed as undeniable evidence of his unworthiness to hold either fortune or respect. Alexander Grant believed he was invincible. Scandals rarely remain whispers in the shadows anymore. Alexander Grant believed he could control perception. But on that fateful night in the hospital, when his hand struck Evelyn's cheek, the entire illusion shattered into a million pieces. The sound of that slap did not just echo in the waiting room, it ricocheted through the entire world. By morning, it had millions of views. News anchors replayed the footage with grave expressions. Talk show hosts dissected the blatant cruelty. For once, Alexander's name wasn't linked to triumph, but to deep, public shame. He stormed through his penthouse, smashing glasses, shouting at his terrified PR team, "It's fake. It's edited. They're out to ruin me." His own voice, his own hand, his own sneer, all broadcasted to millions of people. His attorneys advised him to apologize, to issue a tearful public statement. But this storm would not pass. Charities returned his donation checks, stating that they could not be associated with his values. More women stepped forward, whispering their own stories of his explosive temper, his arrogance, and his unwanted advances at galas. The hospital itself released a powerful statement condemning his actions and praising Richard Cole for bravely intervening. That single, powerful line, "We stand with Evelyn," was shared across the entire nation. Alexander's empire was bleeding, and Richard was methodically tightening the noose. Meanwhile, Evelyn's face, bruised, pale, but undeniably dignified, appeared on magazine covers everywhere. Some tried to paint her as a helpless victim, but Richard refused to let that be her only story. "I stayed silent for too long. Now, I stand for myself and for my child." She became a symbol for every woman who had ever been silenced by cruelty. He tried to stage a comeback speech at a private investor dinner, but someone leaked a recording of him ranting, "She'll come crawling back. Women like her always do." The recording only fueled the public fire. Richard Cole saw his opportunity. He summoned his legal team. "We'll take him to court. Every dollar, every asset, every single lie will be exposed." For Richard, this wasn't only about vengeance. Evelyn, though nervous, found a new strength in the storm. The hospital waiting room became more than just a scene of cruelty. It became the spark of a revolution in Evelyn's life. After the hospital incident and the viral storm that followed, Evelyn Cole Grant found herself caught between two worlds. The woman who had once believed in fairy tales, and the woman the world suddenly wanted her to become. But behind the closed doors of her father's massive estate, she was simply a daughter, trembling in the aftermath of a profound humiliation. Her father's staff treated her with the kind of reverence one might give to someone sacred, but it only deepened her sense of fragility. She didn't want reverence. She just wanted her life back. At night, she lay awake, haunted by the sound of Alexander's voice. She would bolt upright in bed, her cheek tingling with a phantom pain, her chest tight with panic. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let it get this far." Guilt consumed her. She blamed herself for ignoring the glaring red flags, for silencing her own instincts, for marrying a man her father had warned her about. She felt deeply ashamed that she had endured months of belittlement and still stayed. "I was weak," she sobbed to her reflection one morning. "I was so weak." Her reflection stared back at her, tired eyes, pale skin, a swollen body. She lost weight, though she could hardly afford to. Doctors scolded her gently, reminding her that the stress could harm the baby. Her collapse reached its peak one stormy night. She clutched a letter from her mother, written years before her death. The words blurred through her tears. For hours, she wept, her sobs echoing against the silent walls. But then, in the darkest hour, something shifted. It startled her, forcing her to catch her breath. The child was alive, vibrant, and demanding to be acknowledged. Evelyn pressed both hands against her belly, her tears finally slowing. For the first time in days, she felt not guilt, not despair, but a flicker of a powerful connection. "You're fighting, aren't you?" she whispered. "You're still fighting even when I'm not." Still, the collapse had left its scars. Evelyn remained fragile, her hands often trembling during interviews, her eyes haunted when the lawyers asked her to recount Alexander's cruelty. But beneath the fragility, something was beginning to harden. She was tired of being pitted, tired of being whispered about, tired of being the symbol of shame in a story she hadn't written. Her collapse had broken her, but it had also cleansed her. What they didn't know was that Evelyn's father, Richard Cole, was no ordinary man. Behind his calm exterior and silver temples was a predator, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. He was about to learn the devastating truth. Richard had been sharpening his claws for decades, and now, he had a powerful reason to finally unleash them. Richard Cole wasn't just a wealthy businessman, he was a titan. His company, Cole International, wasn't confined to just one industry. It sprawled across finance, real estate, energy, and technology. Judges owed him favors. Journalists sought his approval before printing their stories. To him, Alexander was nothing more than a cockroach in a skyscraper, loud, flashy, but ultimately crushable. Yet, Richard had stayed quiet for years, respecting Evelyn's choice to marry Alexander despite his grave doubts. But when he saw Alexander's hand strike her in that hospital, something inside him broke, not just as a father, but as a man. And so, he vowed that the man who had hurt his daughter would not only lose his fortune, he would lose everything. The twist began with silence. While investors panicked, Richard quietly bought up stock in Alexander's company through various shell corporations, destabilizing the board from within. The world thought Richard was just waiting, but in truth, he was already pulling all the strings. Evelyn didn't understand the true scale of her father's reach until one evening when he invited her into his study. The room smelled of rich leather and cedar, lined with books and old photographs. Richard gestured for her to sit down. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, sliding a folder toward her. Evelyn opened it with trembling hands. Her breath caught in her throat. "How? How do you have all of this?" Richard's eyes hardened. "I've had men watching him since the day you married him. I hoped I would never need this, but now. Now it's time." All those years while she had felt so completely alone, her father had been quietly preparing for this moment. "You knew," she whispered. "I suspected," Richard corrected gently. "And I was ready. That's what real power is, Evelyn. Not money, not fame. Preparation and patience. And now, it's his turn to bleed." The strategy was brutal and efficient. Richard's attorneys filed for emergency court hearings, demanding full financial audits of Alexander's company. His PR team strategically leaked carefully chosen documents to the press, tax irregularities, shady overseas deals, unpaid employees. Each leak was timed like a dagger, striking just as Alexander tried desperately to rebuild his shattered image. Within weeks, Grant Dynamics was no longer a rising star in the business world, but a sinking ship. The man who had once bragged that the rules didn't apply to him suddenly found himself buried under a mountain of subpoenas. She had always known her father was powerful, but she had never truly understood the incredible depth of his influence. For the first time since the slap, she felt something stronger than despair, hope. She wasn't alone. She had an army, led by a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of war in boardrooms and courtrooms. Alexander, however, was completely unraveling. The more Richard struck, the more desperate he became. He called Evelyn late one night, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You think hiding behind your daddy makes you strong? You'll regret this, Evelyn. You'll regret ever crossing me." "I don't regret anything. Not anymore." That single moment marked her rebirth. Her silence had never protected her, but her voice could completely destroy him. The twist wasn't just about Richard's power. It was about Evelyn's awakening. Together, they weren't just fighting for survival. Because when a father fights for his daughter, there is no empire strong enough to survive his wrath. But the storm that followed the hospital incident changed absolutely everything. She had collapsed, yes. She had cried, doubted, and broken. And when Evelyn rose, she rose with a fire that no one could have ever predicted. Evelyn, who had once whispered apologies to her unborn child in the dark, began whispering promises instead. "I will protect you. I will fight for you. I will never let anyone hurt us again." Each night, she repeated those vows until her voice grew stronger and steadier. Her child became her anchor. Her father noticed the change first. "I'm ready," she told him simply. "Whatever comes next, I'm ready." The transformation then moved outward. Her father's staff arranged fittings with top designers who understood her journey. Her hair, once left in simple, unassuming styles, was cut and shaped to frame her face with confidence. Makeup artists taught her how to highlight the sharpness in her eyes, the sheer determination in her jawline. Her shoulders were squared, and her steps grew deliberate and sure. The media noticed immediately. Gone was the timid, tearful woman hiding behind sunglasses. In her place stood a radiant, composed figure, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her father standing proudly by her side. At first, she listened quietly, intimidated by all the legal jargon. But soon, she began asking sharp questions, pointing out crucial details that others had missed. "He kept all of our accounts separate," she said once, her voice calm and clear. "He didn't let me touch anything. If you look at the transfers around the time of our wedding, you'll see where he started hiding his assets." She wasn't just a client anymore. She was becoming a strategist. Day by day, Evelyn learned. She studied documents, memorized timelines, and rehearsed her testimony. "She has her mother's sharpness," one whispered to Richard. "And your fire." It was fueled by her own powerful decision to reclaim her life. "I lost myself," she admitted. "But I'm finding my way back." When the Justice for Evelyn movement exploded online, women from all across the country began sharing their own stories of abuse. "You are not alone," she wrote. "You are stronger than you think." Those words, simple but deeply sincere, inspired thousands. Her transformation reached its peak the night she attended a charity gala hosted by her father's foundation. It was her first major public appearance since the scandal, and the entire world was watching. Cameras flashed as she arrived, radiant in a crimson gown that shimmered under the grand chandeliers. He had expected Evelyn to cower, to remain a broken, pathetic shadow. Instead, she was commanding the spotlight he had once hoarded all for himself. At the gala, Evelyn took the stage briefly, her voice steady as she addressed the silent crowd. "A few months ago, I thought my story was over. I thought my voice didn't matter. But I was wrong." The audience erupted in a wave of thunderous applause, some with tears in their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they had just witnessed a defining moment. Her transformation was now complete. Not because she had changed into someone new, but because she had returned to the woman she had always been, buried for too long beneath Alexander's cruelty. And as she stepped off the stage, Richard whispered in her ear, "Now he should be afraid. Because when a woman rises from the ashes, she doesn't just stand, she soars." The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the long marble steps, their microphones clutched tight, their cameras flashing like lightning against the gray morning sky. Her father followed, his powerful presence commanding respect in a sharp charcoal suit. They walked side by side through the flashing cameras, completely unflinching, while chants erupted from the supportive crowd. "Justice for Evelyn! Justice for Evelyn!" Alexander arrived just minutes later, his usual swagger noticeably dimmed. He wore a forced, tight smile, clutching his lawyer's arm as though it could somehow shield him from the public scorn. Signs waved high in the air, "No excuse for abuse, power won't protect you." For the first time in his entire career, Alexander faced a world that completely despised him. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The judge presided from a high bench, her gavel ready to command silence. Richard's legal team sat with mountains of documents all neatly stacked, while Alexander's lawyers whispered frantically, flipping through their disorganized notes. Evelyn sat calmly between her father and a seasoned attorney, her hands resting peacefully on her belly. Though her heart pounded in her chest, her eyes were steady. The opening statement immediately set the tone for the entire trial. "This case is not only about money," he declared. "It is about cruelty, deception, and justice for a woman who was silenced for far too long. We will show you the truth about Alexander Grant, a man who built his empire on lies and treated his own wife as nothing more than property. But today, the truth will prevail." The room stirred with murmurs. Alexander's lawyer tried to counter, painting Evelyn as an overly emotional woman who was exaggerating private disputes. "Marriage is complicated," he insisted. "Arguments happen. My client is guilty of nothing more than a momentary lapse of temper." The video of the hospital slap had already spoken louder than any flimsy excuse could. Bank records showed millions of dollars funneled into secret offshore accounts. Witnesses testified one after another, former assistants, former girlfriends, even former business associates, each telling their own stories of his explosive temper, his arrogance, and his abuse. Piece by piece, Alexander's empire crumbled under the crushing weight of the truth. The courtroom fell completely silent as she walked to the witness chair, her steps deliberate, her head held high. She swore an oath and then turned to face the jury. For a moment, she hesitated, her throat tight with emotion. She spoke of the early days of their marriage, the charm that had once blinded her, and the gradual descent into control and cruelty. She described the nights she had cried alone, the words that had cut deeper than any knife, and the fear that had grown with each new act of violence. When she recounted the slap in the hospital, her hand unconsciously brushed against her cheek, and the entire jury leaned forward, completely captivated by her testimony. "I stayed silent," she said, her voice breaking but clear. "Because I thought silence would keep me safe. But silence only gave him more power. I will not be silent anymore. Not for me, not for my child, not for anyone who has ever been hurt and told to just endure it." Even the judge's expression softened slightly before she rapped the gavel for order. Alexander, red-faced and seething, clenched his fists, whispering angrily to his lawyer. "You're nothing without me. Stop whining and do your job." Each word dug deeper into the coffin of his already failing defense. Finally, Richard himself took the stand. Not as a powerful CEO, but as a father. His testimony was brief, but absolutely devastating. The trial stretched on for weeks, but the outcome was clear from the very start. The jury deliberated for less than a single day. Gasps filled the room. Cameras outside exploded with flashes as the verdict spread like wildfire. Richard squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening with pride. Alexander, meanwhile, collapsed into his chair, pale and trembling. His fortune, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was slipping away. Her silence, once her prison, had become her sharpest weapon. "Today isn't just about me. It's about every woman who has ever been silenced. Every woman who has been told she was too weak, too small, too powerless. Let this be proof that you are stronger than they will ever admit. And when you stand, the world will stand with you. Because revenge is sweetest not in private whispers, but in public victories. The courthouse battle had ended, but for Evelyn, the story was only just beginning. The cameras captured her smiling through her tears, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her father standing beside her like a pillar of unwavering strength. Fathers admired Richard's fierce resolve. And Alexander Grant's name became synonymous with disgrace. But Evelyn's true victory wasn't in the millions stripped from Alexander's fortune or the headlines celebrating her triumph. It was in the steady beat of her own heart, no longer racing with fear. It was in the absolute certainty that her child would be born into a world where love, not cruelty, reigned. He was no longer a millionaire tycoon, but a disgraced fraudster awaiting his sentencing. He had fallen, and there would be no rising again for him. She launched a foundation for women and children escaping abusive homes, naming it the Phoenix Fund. Reporters asked why she chose that particular name. She smiled softly and said, "Because even from the ashes, we can rise." Donations poured in from all around the globe. She read each and every one with tears in her eyes, determined to honor their voices. Her transformation rippled outward. No longer hiding, she attended public events with grace and confidence, her very presence commanding respect. "You're carrying the next generation," Richard said one evening as they sat together in the garden, the summer breeze rustling through the trees. The day her child was born was the true climax of her incredible journey. In a private hospital suite, surrounded by trusted doctors with her father at her side, Evelyn gave birth to a healthy baby girl. "Welcome home, my love," she whispered. "You'll never know fear. You'll only know love." Richard, holding the tiny bundle in his arms later, whispered to his granddaughter, "You're the reason we fought, and you'll always be safe." But for Evelyn, it was deeply personal. It was healing. Holding her daughter, she finally released the last fragments of her guilt and pain. She realized she had been strong all along. Her silence had never been weakness. It had only been waiting for the right moment to roar. Months passed, and Evelyn flourished. Her foundation expanded. Her voice became sought after at conferences and interviews. She didn't glamorize her suffering, but she spoke of it with a raw honesty, reminding others that their dignity could always be reclaimed. Each speech ended with the same powerful words, "Your voice is your power. Never give it away." The man who once believed the world revolved around him was simply forgotten, a mere footnote in Evelyn's triumphant story. This time, she walked in with her daughter in her arms, her father by her side. Nurses and patients recognized her immediately, their eyes wide with recognition. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and proud. Her journey had taught her the deepest truth. Pain could break you, but it could also build you. Silence could chain you, but it could also prepare you to shout louder than ever before. And love for a child, for family, and for oneself was the greatest weapon of all. As she left the hospital that day, cameras waiting outside captured her radiant smile. And as the world celebrated her, Evelyn whispered one final vow to her precious daughter. "No one will ever silence us again. We are free. We are strong. And we will always rise." And just like that, a new legacy began, not of inherited wealth, but of earned strength. Evelyn and her daughter, little Elizabeth, named after a grandmother she would only know through stories of kindness, built a life filled with laughter, learning, and unwavering love. Richard Cole, the titan of industry, found his greatest joy not in the boardroom, but in being a doting grandfather, teaching Elizabeth how to be both gentle and strong. Evelyn's Phoenix Fund grew into a global force for good, a testament to the fact that from the deepest wounds can grow the most beautiful gardens of hope. And that, my friends, is the most powerful story of all. If this journey moved you, if it sparked something inside your own heart, then don't let that feeling fade.